Now we are going to take a peek into this scene, a rather old one. In fact, this is the first project I did in Corona at the beginning of 2018, so we may encounter some strange or archaic solutions here, but about that in a moment. As Arthur has done so far, we'll go through the compositional and lighting aspects of this shot one by one. And as far as this picture is concerned, it's certainly a rather simple but very effective composition. It is based on the creation of a kind of focal point in the form of a twisted ellipse, where we have a ray of sunset light cast at some really expressive rocks. Our architectural objects are placed on these rocks. The depth is very clearly established. We have areas here that are sort of muted, which boost our perception of this center. We can visually map out a path from the camera all the way to these white structures on the rocks. We can see all the space in between, so that's also an advantage that lets us understand the space better. If we had a lack of continuity of terrain here, some drop-offs, it would change our sense of scale a bit. In addition, here we have an epic use of geometric contrast. Soft, custom-bashed clouds contrasted with sharp lines of light on the rocks. We are trying to remember what it looks like here, and let's move to the 3D view. This is our scene in object color, and what immediately strikes our eyes is exactly what used to be this empty negative space in the final rendering. Here it doesn't necessarily look that way yet, whether it's the space at the bottom of the frame or the sky. From the bottom we have a gravel foreground with some snowy parts, and generally there is a potential here for it to ring out with such a very strong micro contrast. However, we deliberately plunge this right into the shadows to mute this area, so that it doesn't compete with our midground, and simply provides a kind of contextual foreground, a space that gives a lot of breath here. And similarly, we have here this negative space of the sky. For the moment it takes up a third of the frame, but remember that this final image looks a little different. In post-production we add a lot more sky, also a lot of height, and there will be almost full cloud cover here. Most of these clouds will be very dark, very uniform. Basically we can say that this area plays typically as a negative space, which leaves a breath and allows these most important elements to resound. We can leave our camera view and see ourselves what's happening in the scene. And we can see this camera somewhere here, basically suspended in the space. The scene itself is relatively simple. We can see that everything is built simply for just this camera view. That's why we are not surprised that these elements are drifting in space somewhere there. We use such an option very often when building a composition. We have our cabins, our rocks, somewhere here grouped in space. In front of the camera, one currently selected object, some 3D scan, which constitutes this foreground. In the background, the mountains. In the composition they are not more than 1/8 or 1/10 of this image, so they don't play a very important role. And this is a pretty typical scenario that we learned in Overcast Lesson 2. That is, we have a lot of cloud cover and we let rays of sunset in somewhere here. These spheres allow us to control this effect. In this case, they don't even have volumetric material on them, just ordinary dark blue diffuse material. We can see it now. Yes, this is just some ordinary, just almost black material applied to the spheres. And that was enough to make it work. Anyway, they do the job and they perform exactly the same task that we built with volumetric spheres. We use them to control where we want light in the scene. Here we also have a box with volumetrics. And we can also peek into it right away. And again, there is nothing special here. 40,000 centimeters, color close to almost white, and no directionality. At the time I didn't play with such advanced stuff. The fog was simply a fog and nothing more about it. Anyway, it was just enough here, and this is how the scene looks. As for the assets, here we have a mix of some homemade assets, like these mountains I made, I think, in World Machine, like also the cabins themselves, modeled, here they are as proxy, modeled in Marvel's Designer. So this is homemade, while the assets of rocks, some photogrammetry there is probably ArtStation Marketplace or CG Trader or Sketchfab. And that would be all about the construction of this scene. We can see that it is really trivial. As for the lighting, we can go into the render setup and see what it looks like. And some people might be very surprised, so hold on tight, because as far as illumination goes, like I said, this is the first project I've done in Corona and there are various archaic solutions. One of them is that we are lighting it using an HDRI plugged into a V-Ray bitmap. But it worked. It still works, so we can still do it. As for the HDRI, we have a sunset map from No Emotion and it works fine. We mentioned in lesson number 8 that HDRIs from No Emotion can do quite well in illumination, especially when it comes to cases like this, where we have a lower dynamic range. Maybe today, as I would build this scene, I would choose something else as such a go-to solution, but it worked then and it still works, so there is no need to mess around. Well, and that's basically it as far as these main settings are concerned. We can see how it looks in interactive. Yes, so we can see from the beginning that the foundation of this picture is already there. However, compared to the previous work Arthur discussed, there is still some way to go before we get what we saw in the final image. In any case, we already have the colors pretty much isolated, only thanks to HDRI illumination and due to those spheres that arrange the lighting pattern. Complementary palette, certainly a very distinctive contrast. Those blues and purples have a chance to gain saturation, even if they are darker. Oranges, on the other hand, need some brightness for that, and it works just like that here. This is typical for this color play, for this palette. The depth seems quite naturally established, but in the post-production stage we'll see how much more drama can be drawn out of this. Let's maybe see what happens in this tone mapping. We have it worked out with a filmic mapping, both on highlights and in the shadows. We have uploaded the basic Corona LUT, the first one on the list. At the time, it seemed to me that it was always better with LUT. Now, I wouldn't necessarily put it in here, I would just play with the color in Photoshop based on the raw render, but in any case, it just changes the starting position I had there. We can see what it looks like in black and white. And maybe we can yet add a histogram. We can see here that detail is not lost in any of the regions. These highlights in general are offset from this upper range and they fall off for us somewhere down here, around more than 70%. The mid-range falls roughly in the middle, a little bit close to the shadows. So we might expect more punchy contrast. This can be noticed right away. First of all, you can see that both shadows and highlights are quite isolated relative to each other. And if you look at this image and not at the histogram, you can see that it doesn't quite work yet. For example, we would like the cabins to be the brightest areas in it and not those arbitrary snow patches. Also, these rocks land quite low, in the sense that the shadows are quite okay, but I think they could use a little more brightness here in these lit parts. So watching this in black and white, you can already sketch out a certain plan for the work in post-production. And that's basically what I did. This image definitely benefited a lot from post-production. Okay, maybe we turn off those curves, turn off that LUT, and we see that if we turn it off, the readability improves dramatically. We add this aspect of color, which in itself we see, even leaving out the tonal aspect, is able to build that readability. We can see that this volumetric box adds this impression of depth. It's a bit of a must-have to build it up, even if we are only talking about a small part of the picture, in that 1/8, 1/10 of it. And maybe we'll come back to those spheres now, because basically they really build up this scenario. As I mentioned, it's somewhat analogous to this overcast lesson number 2. The scene is based primarily on this composition, on playing with these quasi-clouds. If we remove them, hide them in the scene, we can see that this perception changes dramatically. Yes, and we basically lose most of that effect that we had. Suddenly the relationship of light to shadows, these colors, how these assets behave in full light, it all looks terrible. This color is lost here. We had this color set up quite nicely, and now all of a sudden it's all off and it's just very far from what we had a moment ago. The light is coming in from all sides, and there are some overexposed areas, and it just doesn't look too pleasing. So the issue of introducing these clouds is crucial here. We can note that in this scene we don't have any box, no tunnel vision surrounding the camera. But the spheres, we can bring them back. These spheres serve a similar role. We can see and they are back, and immediately we have a completely different picture. The deep shadows from these spheres function similarly to this produced by box or by tunnel vision. We could set it up additionally to still have control over the foreground. But anyway, we can say that basically through these spheres we get a deeper perception of the composition. And basically these spheres build us a picture. And the last thing we want to pay attention to is the sky. As we can see, this sky looks completely different. This is the sky simply from HDRI map. As I mentioned, I was going to do something more custom in the post-production stage, expand the frame up a bit, which I will talk about in a moment. I think that's it as far as the construction of this scene and the artistic thought goes. We can see what the post-production more or less looked like in Photoshop. We have more or less this raw render, at least as it came out this few years ago. And we have the post-production in Photoshop, which I simplified a bit to make it easier to go through. This file was originally just one big chaos. So here we have separately what we did with the foreground and separately what we did here with the background. We have this sky rendered with direct HDRI view for now, and this post-production is basically all about the custom bashing of the sky and catching up with the rest of the image so that we still pull out this contrast, this brightness, these colors, but according to this base that's already here. So one by one, using different images, I bash this sky, playing with the contrast and with the saturation. And I don't have it here as an adjustment layer, but as I said, this is a file from many years ago and it was all quite chaotic. But you know, we learned how to do it. Just the simplest operations on the curves, on the colors, just in order to somehow put it all together. And most importantly, to put these cloud formations together into something that reads as plausible, as believable, that this is just one uniform sky and not a bunch of photos put together. yes, we are introducing some gradients of solid color to clamp it together color-wise too, with this volumetrics, which has taken on an orange hue from that light from the HDRI. Here again, solid color from the right, so that we lose a little bit of that contrast on those clouds. And we remember that we are aiming for this kind of feeling of the sky, which will be heavy, cloudy, but at the same time, pretty solid and uniform, playing as a negative space. So again, here are still such spots to clear it. And it starts to come together, more or less. We can see that. Maybe here I will copy it and move it here, right underneath. Before we had a cutoff from a completely different sky. And now, what's happening here, above those cabins, is starting to be similar to what's happening here, below them. So this picture is coming together. The next steps just consisted of increasing this contrast in our focal point area, selectively. Cabins from such dim orange we pull into much brighter, almost off-white. And we read that it's already some sort of slightly tinted white, not some dull, ugly gray color. And now they definitely pop out much more than those snow patches. And that's what we noticed earlier when we talked about the black and white image in 3ds Max. Some further gradient from the bottom to introduce some vignette. And here is the color play. Yes, there's a lot going on here. These oranges, a little more saturation, a little higher. As for the muted colors in the clouds, in the ground area, we are turning them a little bit towards this kind of cyan, towards blue. And here we are still a bit selectively painting the mists on these mountains with brushes. What we basically did in the volumetric lesson number 2. And it also comes in here. To just cut down a bit on that unpleasant CG look on that mountain ridge. We want to hide it, so there was a little overpainting here. We are pushing the color down even more. The cyans, these purples, pulling out the oranges to play up the contrast even more. And finally, we add this portion of sky here. Basically a dark navy blue with no detail. But as we can see, from this composition, let's say pretty safe, in which the subject occupies a large area of the frame, we move into a composition where we allow a huge expanse of negative space. It's such a bit more of a bold move, but I think it works very well here, and it's basically the final image. Now we can take another look at how it looks in black and white. We remember how it looked a while ago in 3ds Max. There we had a problem to tell in black and white what the composition was about exactly. We remember that we had a problem with snow, and it was just jumping forward a bit. Those mountains were also, in terms of those highlights, darker, for example, than what was going on in the foreground. And now it all has a better hierarchy. The picture basically closes in this area. We can also take a peek at the saturation. This is just a pass that shows the saturation itself in the image. We can see that basically the big saturation is in the oranges, and in the blues it is relatively small. This is what we are talking about earlier when discussing this scenario in 3D, which is that blues, purples, don't need high saturation to perceptually resonate as a color. In contrast, oranges or yellows need this saturation more, so that they are able to resound in our perception as strong saturated colors. We'll talk about how we take out the paths of saturation in Photoshop to see it as an independent element in the next examples, where we will do more advanced analysis. And this can be a useful tool whether we are dealing with visualization or even photography, because sometimes we can notice where, for example, the saturation is too high and where we lose detail due to this clamping. Nevertheless, for now, just such a sneak peek of this option. We won't discuss it now, we just take a look at this image from a bit different angle. As for this scene, I think that's it. One last example in this bonus lesson awaits us, which we'll talk about in a second. At the very end, we'll talk about this scene, this visualization. As we see, the Blue Hour night scene. And we are going to have a very big repeat of what we've been learning about night. The typology coincides completely with what we've been learning, so you can consider this a way to refresh this knowledge with another example. This is an old scene that I did many years ago, and with old scenes you can see that some things were done unconsciously or with important details left out. And this will be a good opportunity to show how something can be done differently, being richer in the whole assortment of image theory, lighting tricks, and knowing how it relates to composition. Let's start, as we did before, with a few words regarding the geometric core. We can see what the picture looks like in a very crude form when we paint the main forms. And what is immediately striking, for example, is the repetitive dominant element in the form of rocks or architectural elements that refer to these rocks. This repetition of the vertical elements allows us to build readability of scale very efficiently. In addition, we can look at how the negative space is positioned in this picture, in the form of the sky or the surface of the pool. And the negative space builds the composition itself, right? It separates 1/3 of the main part of the frame. It is the main compositional axis. This is a certain interesting relationship of forms, which works both in a full-scale format and in a form of a thumbnail. If you look at this picture in detail, if you draw in the main compositional lines, you will notice another characteristic thing. The break of these vertical forms determines the main compositional axis, which also coincides with the negative space. The viewer's eye will travel along this path, and eventually it will focus on the architecture, which is here in the background, the culmination of this axis. And this is helped, of course, by the rhythms we have set according to the typology of light. But about that in a moment. Now we can move on to our scene and see what it looks like. As for that scene in 3D, we also have it all built up around what the camera can actually see. And this is our camera suspended basically at the edge of the empty space, which is how we had it most of the time, not enclosed by anything from behind. And this whole scene is built typically for what this camera sees, including these rocks in the background. Of course, closer to that pool, the asset density increases. We didn't want to have any unexpected holes in the scene, so it's so much more curated down here. But the further away from the center of the composition, this continuity of the terrain is so much less precise. When it comes to this culmination, we have this house, this residential complex, also heavily surrounded by rocks. In terms of the assets, we got these rocks from various sources, but primarily from terrain domain, which at that point in time, when this scene was built, was the only source of these Hoodoo-type chimney rocks. Now you can get them as part of Megascans or from some other photogrammetry sources on TurboSquid or CG Trader. Nevertheless, at the time it was the only one. And we have this supplemented with smaller, lower sandstones from Quixel. The plants are mostly from Max3, and there are still a couple of different minor assets from Sketchfab, but as I said, mainly Max3, Terrain Domain, and Quixel. And if we look at it in 3D view, then paradoxically, contrary to what I just said, this negative space is a bit lacking in this shot. That's because at the post-production stage I decided to add some sky to fix this. Nevertheless, this composition is still relatively balanced. It's based on the contrast in detail frequency. We have some low details frequency areas in order for the detailed rest of the scene to resonate. And here, of course, is that pool area. In post-production, I also added part of the image on the left in the form of this rocky outlier to better build a sense of depth in the scene. There's nothing stopping you from doing it in 3D, of course, but I just forgot or didn't see that need early enough, and I had to correct myself later in post-production. Okay, so much for discussing this scene. We can see how it looks in terms of lighting. Namely, we are lighting here with HDRI 1957 from PG Skies. Just a bitmap plugged in, no color correction, no additional gamma or exposure settings here. As for volumetrics, we have global volumetrics. Also a very simple distance setting, no directionality. Here is a slightly offset mid-gray, and we still have a box with additional volumetrics locally in the background. The settings are also trivial here. We can click Start Interactive here to see what it looked like at this stage. The first thing that draws attention is the mid-range placed very low. Everything is dark, which we'll have to change later in Photoshop. The aerial perspective isn't very blunt either, so something is visible there, but it's pretty weak. It's hard to read where the background is. The depth is not entirely clear. We'll see how it looks in black and white, and also we'll turn on the histogram, as usually. As I said, the whole thing is very dark. These mid-ranges start around 30–40% and are next to blacks. And blacks practically go all the way down here. The deepest blacks are here in these farthest rocks. We should have an aerial perspective more pronounced there, but instead we have practically pitch black object. Bright elements, light sources, really pop out of all this. Generally, the mid-ranges here have no space to ring out. There is either a deep shadow or a relatively high highlight, and this picture in these tonal ranges doesn't look very attractive. Of course, any of these elements can be pulled out in Photoshop, as we'll show in a moment. But in retrospect, it's just good to have 100% control at every stage of the work, rather than waiting to regain it in post-production. We'll do an even deeper color analysis in Photoshop and say a bit more about the colors themselves in the final image. So for now, we can turn this off and move on to the night light typology. We hope you remember the step-by-step execution of lighting operations. If you don't, we encourage you to watch again the first lesson of nighttime scenario. Now, we are going to click through what affects what, as we have learned this before. When it comes to this lighting, we have 4 layers. The first is atmospheric lighting, or HDRI. Here we didn't do any relighting, we didn't insert anything, because, as I said, this is the old work, so this workflow was not yet caught up, refined in such a way. Besides, the next layer of this lighting is the interior lighting. That is what we see in these rooms amid the rocks. And we are trying to create an impression of interior luminosity. We can glance at this scene in top view, and then you can see how these lights are arranged here. We can see that the interior lights are placed within this block. These are mainly auxiliary lights, planes under the ceiling, also spheres in some places. These spheres are meant to imitate the lights that are coming from these skylights, or somewhere here between these rocks. So this sphere, here we have them as interior lights. Maybe here I will break up this group to see what the setting is here. Again, rather no magic at all. Low temperature, intensity matched to the exposure in the scene. It just illuminates these interiors for us, creates a luminous impression, fairly evenly distributed lighting, so it's all good here. That's all as far as interior lighting is concerned. Then we have architectural lighting as the next layer. And here we don't have typical architectural lights, for the reason that the architecture is sort of unified with the surroundings. You know, we have just a visible part of the roof, some of these skylights. On the other hand, we didn't light it as architecture itself, because our architecture here is all this nature around. That is, these rocks are kind of an extension of the building. They are sort of additional walls of it, metaphorically. We also remember that adding lights by force can quickly end very badly. Here it is completely unnecessary. So we immediately jump to the landscape lighting, our final step. And here there is a little more going on. As I mentioned, we are trying to incorporate this environment into the architecture. So we treat these rocks almost as our walls. We can consider it all just landscape lighting. There are just a couple of types of it. We have spotlights on these edges of the pool that illuminate, for example, these rocks formations for us. We can see them illuminating them from the bottom. Here we have a 3ds Max target light with Corona IES inserted. So this kind of setup is a little reminiscent of the older times, which we don't use anymore, but it still works perfectly fine. Nevertheless, nowadays we only use Corona lights with IES for the simplicity's sake. You know, there are more settings here, a little more things can get complicated. We have to remember to set Corona shadows, so in the course we didn't learn about it, because there is no need to go into more legacy lighting solutions. But here we used it a few years ago and it works well. In addition to the spotlights shining on the rocks, we also have spotlights shining inside the pool. They build an interesting rhythm, a sense of space. And just what I said a moment ago, we don't have targets anymore. We have ordinary Corona lights with inserted Corona IES. We can see that they are neither visible directly nor in the reflections or refractions. But this is enough for us anyway to see this cone of light that draws on the bottom of the pool. And it creates a kind of rhythm. These lights are inserted in a very curated way. We are trying to illuminate specific rock formations to build a sense of friendliness of the space around the building, so that it's not a wild, dark nature, but there's an element that is taming that. As I already mentioned, the lights are evenly spaced to create impressions of rhythm, which also adds to a sense of taming, that we are introducing some order. And we just play with the direction of these lights. Of course, as for the ones in the pool, we have a fixed direction. If we removed all these lights, we can see that, of course, the perception changes. The pool lights are gone, and immediately this pool from such a pleasant, luxurious space changed into an unattractive dark pond, where you don't know what lurks. Likewise, if we hit those lights that shine on the rocks, we have the impression of a building sort of besieged in its surroundings. Even aside from the fact that it looks poor with these tonal ranges, we don't have this light at all. So at this point it's more like this wilderness refuge, where everything around is very harsh and not necessarily inviting. Whereas if these lights come back here, we are transformed back into a feeling of coziness and luxury. It is simply a landscaped garden again. Rocky because rocky, but a garden, not a space that we don't want to explore, that we are afraid of. So, in my opinion, this is very important. And to sum up, we have a very clear layering of light structure. Atmospheric lighting, interior lighting, and landscape lighting. And at this stage, this image, the form of it, the colors, the qualities, it all leaves a little bit to be desired. But maybe let's say more about it already at the post-production stage and how we came to it. This can be turned off and let's go to Photoshop. We have a post-production file here. Basically, a one that we merged from a couple of original files, because as I said, it's an old project done pretty chaotically. Also, this is why this post-production doesn't necessarily have a perfect logic in it. So we start with small manual adjustments. As you can see on this cacti here, I tried to make some of these highlights a bit darker. Really, such a small detail as a first move. Perhaps just to calm it down a little bit, to make it more apparent where the problems really lie in this picture. The first big move I made is adding the sky from the top. It's how we change this frame. Suddenly there's this new negative space. We add a little bit of a vignette, and we add the moon to introduce a little bit more interest to this area. And this is the first aspect that significantly changes the perception of this image. Then we add a little bit of curves to change the distribution of the mid-ranges, to finally free them from the deep blacks. We add this highlight, the central highlight, to make this hierarchy of the image easier to read. It's here on the soft light that we give some white in the center of the composition, so that this area clearly moves forward. And then we have some color play. The idea is to isolate these colors a bit more, to get rid of that purple tint that we had everywhere at the contact point of blue and orange. We are adding an orange or orange-reddish look to the rocks fairly consistently. We isolate these rocks from the blue ones. So before, we've had these colors kind of spilling everywhere a little bit. Now we have them more isolated, right? More, let's say, consistently complementary. Then we do selective adjustments again. And just minor tweaks here on the ground and in the rocks to make them blend a bit better. Then we go back to building depth. That is, first of all, we lower the ranges of these rocks in the foreground, so that they retreat a little bit. We generally lower the foreground. We can see some vignettes, some selectively darkening of these areas. We still go back to the aerial perspective and we pour in a bit of a color manually, on these mountains, on these objects further away. We are using the tools we learned, that is, for example, Z-depth. We want to make it seem more smoky and less contrasty. And immediately this depth starts to work a little bit better. This is another big move that we did here. Then I came to the conclusion that I don't really like this form of the skylight here. So I went back to 3ds Max, re-rendered and substituted it. I did a patch rendering. So there's a little bit of clumsy playing back and forth. At the same time, I didn't like that rock in the foreground, that it's not soaring enough above the horizon. So I replaced it with a more protruding rocky outlier. We can see how it changes. At the same time, there is some color play here, some bloom. Chromatic aberration also appears. We can see some of it on this rock, so everything loses that CG look. Everything merges into a whole a little bit more. And I don't have all these operations individually shown here. It was done across several different files, so we try to focus on the overall feel of what's going on, and not necessarily on the technical details. We should know them more or less from the training. Here, the last step we have to do is just to say that we are missing that part of the image on the left and a little bit on the right. So we are adding some more rocks. These are the ones simply pasted into D in Photoshop, and then we just try to merge it with the help of some edge softness, aberration or haze spilling out of the brighter parts. It is a method that is not very orderly here, but it worked at the time. As we can see in this last step, these levels are rising, so those deep blacks that we had at the beginning get lost. When we take and compare what we had at the beginning with what we have now, I think the difference is noticeable pretty quickly. So we have seen all these big moves that we had in post-production. It's mainly adding the sky, modifying the colors so that they are more isolated. We made the depth work a bit more. That is, we lowered the foreground. We added elements in the foreground to build the impression of being in some space that surrounds us. We also manually poured some colors to make it all more credible. We have another patch rendering to substitute some elements in the scene. And we obtain this widening of the frame effect to the side. These are all the big moves that can be determined, and we can see now how this image changed. Let's take a look on it in black and white to peek into the ranges again. We remember that we had them quite low and unpleasant in the frame buffer. These mid-ranges were blended together with the shadows. And here it looks much better. We know what to pay attention to. We can see that this tonal range, this brightness increases as we get closer to the center of the frame. And here it used to be very spread out in all directions, so that's definitely an improvement. Here we can also look at how the saturation is distributed. This is just what we did in the last lesson, and basically we can tell you right now how it works. We use selective color adjustment layer, where for all the color channels, from red to magenta, we move black to -100%. And for all the luminance channels, that is white, neutrals and black, we move black to +100%. This way we make it show the pure saturation component of the image. We can see that now we have highest saturation in the orange highlights associated with the artificial lighting, while the surrounding has it all lower. What's interesting is that these lamps in the pool have a lower saturation. And we see that this is indeed the case. Saturation is often a non-intuitive thing as such an isolated element, because our brains perceive it all together. I mean luminance, saturation and hue. On an analytical level, it's fun to see it in a new light. Sometimes it will surprise us, sometimes not. If we compare it with the raw render, we can see the difference. For example, that these architectural elements of gravel or rocks in the background, have much higher saturation than after post-production. And that's because that unnatural bluish tint used to be more dominant there, and we got rid of it in the process. Now we've got the saturation in places where we really want it to be. That is, on the warm lights, not on the neutral architecture. We can also take a look at the isolated hue aspect. This is also something we haven't done before, but it's kind of a trick that should come in handy. With that, we sort of have the whole trinity isolated. We have brightness, saturation, and hue shown as separate components that together build our image. We are able to check hues in a very simple way. We need to pour mid-gray as solid color and give blending as luminosity. This way we can see only the hues. The problem with this is that often these hues just look the way they look against the mid-grays. It's really hard to see them, except for some maybe very definite areas of colors. We could compare one with the other, but as I said, the human eye in this case is not able to see much difference, or at least differences that would tip us off to something specific. We can see, for example, that this blue in the raw render is more consistent, that this blue appears here on the architecture. We could also add some more saturation to cheat this and give a little boost to the impression of how we see this hue. And here it is already easier to read the differences. Nevertheless, in this image, we don't necessarily come to any specific conclusions based on these hues alone. I think black and white or saturation told us a lot more. Whereas in other works, of course, hue analysis can help with some decisions. So it's useful to have that ability to compare and isolate separate components from an image. It is a trick that is worth knowing. Okay, we did an analysis of some of our work. Such a quick shot of inspiration. Breakdown of how things are done. Some of these were more recent, while other images were pretty old, so we could also compare different approaches that in retrospect are a bit clumsy and we are not entirely proud of them now. But it's clear everyone is making some progress. So it's also worth showing something we used to do, let's say, suboptimally. We think this honesty is important for learning. We also told about some tricks that can come in handy in such characteristic cases. In the next and final bonus lesson, we'll do a very similar analysis, while we will go a little deeper into compositional problems, volumetric effects, generally more advanced matters, but also after our training, being richer with this knowledge you have now, it should not cause many problems. We'll also learn about a few nuances, maybe a few new tricks, which will be such an icing on the cake. So, we'll see you there.